students, faculty, both here and elsewhere in Harvard and all over the Boston area and further afield. It's been a very successful program of creating a community of scholars. As I say, I hope very much you will continue to participate actively in it in the future. Before I pass over to Dennis, I'd like to introduce Justin. Justin runs the student section of CMEI, which is student seminars. We've had some very exciting student seminars this year. If you're a student and you have not yet presented, hopefully next year you'll sign up for this study. He's going to introduce a couple of things.
Sure. So the Civic and Moral Education Initiative Student Seminar Series is a chance for mostly advanced doctoral students to present their work in progress. It tends to be the most cutting edge, innovative, exciting stuff to be able to see. There are two more presentations that are going to be in May. So the first one is going to be by Leticia Braga, and she's done this fabulous qualitative study of Brazilian immigrants from Brazilian backgrounds in the Boston area, looking at their understanding of citizenship and identity. That's going to be in room 308 Longfellow Hall on May 2nd at 2:15. And then actually two first-year doctoral students, or second year doctoral students. James is the first year, and Sylvia is second year. First year and second year doctoral students, Sylvia Ferrens and James Noonan, have been doing some work around peace games, and so there'll be another announcement. But anyway, pay attention to the listserv, pay attention to the CMEI name. There'll be more information about both of them. But on May 2nd and on May 12th at 2:15, there'll be student presentations. It would be great if others would come.
Thank you very much, Justin. I'd also like to thank the other people who've been coordinating CMEI with me, which is Bob Selman and their 11th for their help with running this initiative. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think rather than introducing the panel, it might be good to ask if the panel would introduce themselves.
Okay. My name's Ethan Lowenstein. I'm an associate professor of curriculum and instruction at Eastern Michigan University, which I think at one point graduated 1 out of 6 teachers in the United States. It's a huge program, and we're well known for our focus on teacher education. So I had the honor of leading the teacher portion of this study, and that's what I'll talk about today.
I'm Bob Selman. I'm on the faculty here, and I've been a partner of Facing History for almost 30 years.
I'm seeing that people can't hear too well, so use the mics.
Is the mic on? No. Okay. No, that doesn't do anything.
Here, this one's on, so we might be able to pass this.
Okay. Is yours on even? I'm Bob Selman. Hear me? No?
Get closer
just
to
really
it.
project.
I'm...
It was working before. All right.
No.
I'm Bob Selman, and I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and have been a research partner with Facing History for the past almost 30 years.
Without a microphone, I'm Beth Gamzee from Apt Associates. I'm also an alum of the Ed School. And sensitive to microphone feedback.
Test.
What else I think that's probably all I need to. I'm at Apt Associates. I'm a principal associate at Apt Associates, which is a research and policy firm.
Hi, I'm Rachel McCormick. I'm also at Apt Associates. I was the director of field operations for the MPDEP study and actually started that position right after graduating from here.
Great. So let me find out who's with us here today. So how many of you have come from the community, in other words, outside of the Harvard and Facing History orbits? Anyone here from beyond? Mm-hmm. Can you say, just tell us who you are?
Sure. My name is Kristen Gallus. I'm the Director of Education and Public History with the Tracing Center on Histories and Legacies of Slavery. My daughter Phil, called Races of the Trade, a story from the
Thank you. Glad to have you. And if you're here from Harvard, just from the Harvard community, okay. And the Facing History staff? It's great. Well, this is great to have all of you here. Thank you for coming, and it's very exciting for me personally to see this day arrive. This has been a long journey together with my wonderful colleagues. Can you hear me? Okay. And we are really at the beginning of disseminating what is a very complex study with many facets to it. I also want to just thank Helen and Andrew, who I interfaced with a lot in setting this up, and the CEMI faculty, Bob Selman and Mira Levinson, for making this possible. Margot Strom is somebody who has valued from the beginning of Facing History. She is one of the founders and is the executive director of Facing History. She's always emphasized projects such as this, the importance of discussions that integrate the wisdom of practitioners and scholars from diverse backgrounds and with diverse expertise. Projects that can improve practice, build theory, and impact policy. We have a benefit dinner in Chicago tonight, and she's out of town. Otherwise, she would have loved to have been here. From the beginning, Facing History has drawn on research and theory of scholars to inform its practices, including many from GSE, including Larry Kohlberg, Bob Selman, Carol Gilligan,
Check
Fernando
1 2.
Reavers, Veronica Boismancia, Howard Gardner, and others, and of course many others from other universities as well. This project furthers this conversation among theory, research, and practice that has spanned more than 30 decades. Many scholars have been drawn to Facing History with a wide range of research questions, both basic and evaluation-oriented. Well, this study stands on the shoulders of these previous studies.
Check 1 2.
Welcome. I was a doctoral student in human development and psychology here, I won't say how long ago, when I first heard about Facing History and ourselves. And I had the opportunity, thanks to Bob, to get involved with a project that had to do with reviewing the findings of all the previous studies that Facing History had done or had been done by independent researchers. Well, little did I know that that particular project would lead to a long and lively career working with Facing History, and very closely with Terry Tollefson, who was the previous director of evaluation at Facing History and is here today. He's also still working there, but not as the director of evaluation. That project led to the first sort of major partnership study, but that was a quasi-experimental study. Thank you. Funded by the Carnegie Corporation in New York. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that a little bit later. But Bob Selman, Lynn Schultz, Melinda Fine, and I worked with Facing History staff in the mid-90s to carry out that study. And that was at the thank you. No problem. Clip onto my belt. No problem. Thank you. Okay. Once it's on my belt, it doesn't come off, so there's no way. Is that good? Can I sit? Okay. Thanks. A number of years after the Carnegie study, what we finally referred to as the Carnegie study, I became the director of evaluation. And my current colleagues in evaluation, Anna Rober and Megan Mingo, are here today, so thanks for coming. And over the years, Facing History has been evaluated by both internal and independent researchers. At the same time, Facing History has always been committed to convening scholars from major fields that Facing History identifies with. And that's in order to learn from those scholars, but also to engage in reciprocal interactions between scholars and the practitioners. Facing History sees itself as part of an international community of educators, policymakers, parents, and others who are vitally concerned with strengthening democratic culture in these globally interdependent times. Civic education is a core aspect of Facing History's identity. We draw on the thinking of Helen Haste, Melinda Fine, Connie Flanagan, Mira Levinson, Joe Kahn, Peter Levine, and many others to gain perspective on how Facing History speaks to core issues in the field of civic learning and engagement. The Facing History approach to civic education draws on and speaks to multiple fields of study and practice, however, including moral education, social and emotional learning, character education, Holocaust education, and genocide studies, and teacher professional development, just to name a few. As such, it's a program that defies easy description. However, there's one sentence that I think succinctly captures, I think, what Facing History is in its essence, which is an interdisciplinary model of civic education that integrates a rigorous investigation of history with critical questions about ethics and democratic civic engagement. Don't know which screen to look at. You might have the same problem. Just switch for fun. It's in surround view. In any case, if you listen to what I'm going to read next, which was written by Margot Strom, you'll hear some of the underlying assumptions of the program. My role on the panel today, I should say, is to introduce you to Facing History and the background for this research. And then Ethan will talk about the teacher measurement, Bob will talk about student measurement, and Apt Associates, which is Beth Gamsey and Rachel McCormick, will speak about the study design and findings. Margot writes, as a teacher, I tried to ensure that my students learned what my own teachers failed to teach, that history is largely the result of human decisions, that prevention is possible, and that education must have a moral component if it is to make a difference. Facing History is based on those beliefs. It is also based on the conviction that education in a democracy must be what Alexis de Tocqueville once called an apprenticeship in liberty. That is, it must promote the attitudes, values, and skills needed to live in freedom. Put simply, Facing History courses foster the qualities of heart and mind that are necessary for thoughtful and humane civic participation. More specifically, Facing History offers educators professional development activities, follow-up coaching, compelling content and resources for educators, helping them to develop the beliefs, knowledge, and skills necessary to foster, and I'm going to read this paragraph again to you. I know I'm reading it because I want to get it clear, because this is the basis for what you're going to hear about today. So I'll start over. Professional development and compelling content for educators, helping them to develop the beliefs, knowledge, and skills necessary. So you may be thinking, what are they? Hopefully Ethan will address that. To foster historical understanding, and hopefully Bob will touch on that topic, ethical awareness and civic learning in their students, and Apt Associates will pick up the measurement in those areas when talking about the findings. Each aspect of that sentence, as I mentioned, is part of today. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about the program. One of the challenges, I should say, we faced in designing this study back in 2005 was that Facing History is complex and it is adaptable. It's adaptable for many different educational contexts. Teachers select the specific resources, activities, essential questions, assignments that they're going to use, and that will be appropriate for their context, whether the courses are primarily literature, art, psychology, history, English classes, and whether those courses are taught in high school, middle school, or in higher education. But at the same time, Facing History has core elements. And the approach is built around these core elements, whether it's a course, a unit, a whole year-long sequence, or maybe a multi-year program. One of these elements is what we refer to as the scope and sequence. And that begins with an exploration of identity and membership. Questions such as, who am I? How do others see me? Labeling and stereotyping. And questions about who is in my universe of responsibility. I'm moving quickly through this because I want to leave time to get to the study, but I'm trying to give you just a snapshot of what the it is that was looked at in this research. The foundational resource book, Facing History and Ourselves, Holocaust and Human Behavior, focuses on an in-depth study of the failure of democracy in Germany and the legacies of that history, the events that led to the Holocaust and beyond. The history is examined as something that did not have to happen, but rather was the result of choices made by individuals and groups at all levels of society, including the perpetrators of evil, the victims, the bystanders, the resistors, and collaborators. Students use these concepts as they move through the course and move back and forth between history and today and history and themselves. Students then consider issues of judgment, guilt and responsibility, reconciliation, and what happens when history is denied or revised. And finally, issues related to prevention of violence and the promotion of civil society are covered, looking at models of civic participation from around the world. In short, effective facing history courses embody three key elements. They're intellectually rigorous, emotionally engaging, and involve ethical reflection on moral issues. Another core element is the kind of learning environment that teachers need to set up to make this kind of learning possible. Facing history emphasizes the importance of educators building safe and engaging learning environments where students are encouraged to listen to one another, take perspectives, participate in writing and discussion, as well as through art and other means of expression. We're going to hear more about the kind of learning environment that Facing History believes is important when Ethan talks about some of the scales that we used in the study. Before moving to the current study, I want to spend a few moments highlighting some of the previous research that was the foundation for what we call the NPDEP, which nobody can remember, so think of it as the National Evaluation Study. And first, let me just show you a quick synopsis of the history of evaluation of Facing History, which began under a series of federal grants and research that was conducted on the program internally and independently from the beginning was used to become a member of the National Diffusion Network. And an independent panel of experts reviewed the evaluation research, and then Facing History was disseminated in all 50 states. In 1996, as I mentioned, we began the study called the Carnegie Study, a quasi-experimental study. In 2001, based on evaluation findings, Facing History was deemed a promising program. And in 2005, we launched the current research. Many previous studies have shown high percentages of teachers saying that Facing History revitalizes their interest in teaching, causes them to rethink their teaching methods, and to utilize questioning, classroom discussion, and content that relates to important issues of citizenship and individual responsibility today. Further, teachers report that Facing History, professional development, and using it in the classroom reaffirms their aspirations as teachers. Why did they start teaching in the first place? And increases their satisfaction with teaching. Student research and the findings can be divided broadly into 4 domains of outcomes, the first being academic engagement and motivation. We have positive findings in each of these areas. Historical knowledge and understanding, civic knowledge, skills, and values, including intergroup relations, and social and moral development and ethical awareness. The most rigorous study was the Carnegie study. It was a quasi-experimental study. We picked teachers who were veteran Facing History teachers, and we focused on student outcomes. We had a comparison group of teachers that taught about issues of prejudice and racism using history, but did not use the Facing History approach. We found that there were positive effects for Facing History 8th grade students on their perspective-taking and relational maturity, and decreases in self-reported fighting and racist attitudes. There were limitations to that study in that there's some issues with internal validity. That what I mentioned around self-selection is the key issue here. Who's to say that the teachers weren't different than the comparison teachers to begin with? The measurable characteristics of the two groups suggested that they were similar, but the unmeasured dimensions, as I've learned from apt associates through this process, might have explained the post-test differences. So it could be, as I mentioned, one could argue that the teachers who self-select to Facing History are different than a larger population. Though much was already known about Facing History, but much wasn't known as the 21st century began. And at the same time, evaluation methodology and standards of evidence had changed or evolved. Policymakers, foundations, school administrators, and scholars have been calling for more randomized controlled trials, studies that would provide more conclusive evidence of the causal effect of programs on students and teachers. In 2004, Facing History was involved in a conversation with the Smith Family Foundation about its strategic plan. The Smith Family Foundation has provided support for many different kinds of educational initiatives, not just at Facing History. But they had funded Facing History in the past and were interested in helping Facing History to further its mission. We submitted a proposal which was funded. The foundation was primarily interested in student outcomes. They wanted what they referred to as bulletproof evidence of the program's effectiveness. And I see Sarah Whitman in the room who just smiled when I said that, because she was working with us at that time as well at Facing History on this project. They were not concerned, however, with the specific design of the study. They left that to us. And there was no real us yet, except for Bob Selman and Terry Tollefson and some staff at Facing History talking about what we might do. The big question was, we knew that what would needed would be something beyond a quasi-experimental study. Why invest in something that you already had? But we weren't sure whether it would be feasible with this kind of program. But we needed to know, could ordinary teachers who are not seeking this kind of professional development be similarly educated and inspired? Could they offer similarly high-quality educational experiences with similarly profound effects on their students' academic and civic growth? This speaks to the scalability of Facing History. As Facing History has grown over the years, we've been engaged in whole school reform efforts, district-wide efforts, internationally. And it's not always an individual teacher now who's picking Facing History. Sometimes it's an administrator who's saying, we're going to use this in our district. So would the ordinary teacher, if you will, the teacher not looking for Facing History, benefit from its professional development and be able to implement successfully? So we did a literature review, and it was kind of sobering because we found that there were very few randomized controlled trials that were actually showing any positive effects for students, similar kinds of programs, if there are any, in character education. So we were daunted a bit by that. But we decided we would go forward. And I love Bob's comment that without studies using random assignment, programs can look better than they are, but with them they can look worse than they are. Very pithy and true. So we took the plunge in consultation with people like John Willett and Apt Associates and others who were design experts. We came to believe that it was possible to do and that it was necessary to do. So we decided, however, that we needed to balance the risks for the program. The risk being that there might be no positive findings for Facing History. How did we do that? We invested large amounts of resources in other things, such as measure development, which we believe we highly value and we feel is a contribution that continues to be useful beyond this study. At the same time, we needed to invest in organizational learning. The entire Facing History management team and the regional directors and the evaluation staff and the program staff were all invested in learning from this process. What are we trying to measure? Where can we put a stake in the ground where we believe Facing History will have an impact? What's our theory of change? How can we refine it? All of these kinds of questions were stimulated by the dialogues with our partners. So we decided we could balance out these, the risks of the randomized trial with some other benefits, whether or not Facing History came out on top, if you will. Often you don't find positive findings because of an issue of fidelity of implementation, which I'm hoping that Apt Associates will talk about later. Teachers don't always implement fully what you think is the ideal program. Yet you have to include in this kind of study all of the data in the analysis, whether or not students experienced any of the program or not. So we knew that we needed to partner with independent scholars. This was going to be an independent study, but as you can hear, Facing History staff played a large role in the project. The role evolved, however. In the initial phases, Facing History staff were involved in working with our partners in designing the study, thinking about measures, helping to develop the measures. But when it came time to actually collect data, we needed what we needed objectivity, and Facing History was not involved in that part at all. There was no contact between Facing History and the schools. What we were looking for was as much objectivity and lack of bias as possible. Apt Associates collected the data. Apt did the data analysis. Apt did the initial writing of reports from which interpretations of the findings have been made. I just wanted to show you the numbers of people, and this isn't even everyone, who were involved actively in this research, from Facing History staff to our partners and co-investigators to the researchers from Apt Associates. Finally, at the phase we are in now, which I believe is an ongoing phase as thinking deepens and more research is done, but which I hope Bob will talk about, and maybe Apt will talk about the discussion about effect sizes and changing ideas about what effect sizes are meaningful and practical, have practical significance. There's different types of significance, and this is an ongoing conversation. What's significant for a field theoretically, what's statistically significant, and what's practically significant and meaningful for educators. So with that, I guess I just want to conclude with a couple of, briefly show you a slide that Apt is going to build from, which is the theory of change that we used in the study. Essentially, this shows that Facing History believes that when teachers take its professional development seminars and receive follow-up services and use the resources, they implement a 6-week or longer unit that covers the scope and sequence that I described, we will find impacts on students. But we're measuring impacts on teachers and students over 2 years. 2 years for teachers within the randomized trial, and 1 year for students with an additional study that was not within the experiment but also interesting. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Ethan to fill you in on the teacher aspect of the research. Yeah. Oh, we need to toggle to the other PowerPoint. Thank you. Microphone? Oh, my microphone. Goes in your belt.
No, I think they're on the same power.
No, there's another one. It's the next one over.
Okay. So I really believe, and those of you who are in schools all the time, who are teachers, who have been teachers, know that in the times we live in the reform context that we exist in, even teachers with the strongest ethical commitments may find it difficult to integrate civic learning, ethical learning with the academic subject matter, because the press is so incredibly powerful to focus just on academics. So like I said before, I work at Eastern Michigan University, and most of the teachers that I work with, even the ones who have some training in civic education, are under incredible pressures to focus just on academics. So I wanted to put what we're doing within this context, because that's part of what is very significant about this study and very significant about Facing History, an organization that seeks to provide teachers with an integrative framework where they can meet multiple aims, right, of instruction without abstracting out social learning, civic learning from the academic. So I'll just give you a minute or two to read this quote from a Facing History teacher. So here you see, right, the teacher is saying, you know, for me as a white teacher with almost all African American students, just the courage, just the confidence in my ability to broach very sensitive subjects and discussions with students requires a sense of efficacy, right? Teachers have to believe that they can do this work. even though the context is difficult, right, like I mentioned before, the political context, and the content is difficult. You are raising potentially explosive issues in a highly charged classroom environment with students. So again, we see that the first question might be, can I do it? And of course, right, how do I do it, right? What skills and knowledge do I need to do this? And that gets to the promise of looking at teacher efficacy as an outcome domain. So for these reasons, teacher efficacy was seen as a promising outcome domain for facing history. Number one, because through a lot of interview and anecdotal reports like the one I just showed you, it came up again and again. But it did take us 6 months or longer to agree that this was a domain for facing history, because the organization really had to agree that this was something that it was seeking to impact. The other reason why it's a very promising domain, and the survey that I'm going to describe was a self-report survey, right? So not as powerful as classroom observations or performances of understanding, maybe. But there have been strong relationships demonstrated between teacher sense of efficacy, right? The feeling, the confidence in their own knowledge and skills to achieve certain student outcomes, and student sense of efficacy, student motivation, and academic performance and self-regulated learning. So it was seen as a wise decision to look at this because of the inferences that might be made regarding how teachers perceived of themselves, and then how that might impact students. So what existed in terms of measurement, right? The cheapest thing to do would be to find some measures off the shelf, but there really was very little, right? Unless I know, I might not know of some efforts that are ongoing. In historical understanding, we couldn't really find anything. In civic learning, there were teacher efficacy measures that were fielded in the IEA study, but they focused mostly on teachers' sense of efficacy in teaching topics, certain civic topics, right? And in social moral development, we'll take a look in a second at the first measure that we looked at. And for facing history staff in the room, you might remember me talking to you about this measure and saying, does it reflect facing history or not? So this is some samples of some items, from the Milson Character Education Efficacy Belief Instrument. And what I'm going to have you do for just 30 seconds is turn to a partner and just discuss, given what Dennis has said about the program, how might these items either reflect or not reflect the work of facing history? So just take 30 seconds, a minute, turn to somebody you don't know, introduce yourselves, and discuss that. How might these items either reflect or not reflect what facing history is about?
Oh yeah, we get to talk. Okay.
More or less, I mean, which one?
I don't know, because students' character is a little bit global. And so maybe it sounds like a more traditional way of thinking about positive changes in character. I don't know. How to help the student be more responsible. I don't know. They're all kind of facing history, but they.
The second one is basically tries to remediate. And just the other was.
Oh well, yeah, exactly. The opposite.
All right.
Yeah. But I already know the back of the book.
See? That's what happened when you start a good discussion, right? Good sign when the noise level elevates.
They're a little too global.
So, one or two comments from your conversations. One or two comments from your conversations. What do you think? Pick one. Do you think it might represent what facing history is about or not? Yeah. What's your name? Yeah. Okay.
I said I think the first two definitely fit with facing history, and I think the second one is more an example of the first one, so looking at students' character and making positive changes based on their reflection of history, and one would be looking at responsibility in history. And I said the third one, maybe it won't fit so much, since history should be the model and the teacher should be the mediator.
Yeah. Other folks.
2 more. Come on. Mark, what do you think? Okay. Well, here, let me summarize some of your discussions that I know happened. All right. What do you mean by, you have to remember that this measure had to be used in a study comparing facing history teachers after a year of participation in the program and non-facing history teachers, right? So a lot of teachers might say, yeah, I help, of course, right? I help my students become more responsible. Would any of you say that you don't? Say that, right? And what do you mean by character? Role modeling how and for what purpose, right? Aren't there different kinds of role modeling? And civic role modeling might involve something very, very different than other kinds. And responsibility to who and in what context. So that's an example of a measure we actually included because it was the only existing one in the study, but it really forced us to ask, right, what Dennis was talking about before. How can we look with the program to articulate in very specific ways what a facing history teacher might know and be able to do, and then create efficacy items that mapped onto that knowledge. All right. So here's another example of an anecdotal report. Facing history has helped shape my moral guidepost as a classroom teacher in an urban high school. I'm able to teach a rigorous academic curriculum that deals with issues of fear, hatred, ostracism, war, and the choices we all face. Facing history can't change the conditions in which my kids live, but they continually push me past my doubts so that I can teach my kids about power and choices. Again, it's fairly clear that this is about teacher efficacy, right? But what constitutes academic rigor? And what does a teacher need to know and be able to do in order to teach about power and choices, right? These are very important questions. I saw it done. They modeled the process. I experienced it. Now I feel like I can do it in my classroom. $1 million question, what is it, right? So these are very powerful anecdotal reports, but in terms of measure development, we had to dig very deep in terms of collaborating with the program and also looking to the field in order to further define what we wanted to look at. So thinking about the title of this presentation and the goals that Dennis articulated before, could we design a study that looked at what works, what can and should work, right? Because we're making an argument about a certain kind of instruction, and what the work itself is. What are the specific knowledge and skill domains, right, in history education that has civic and ethical purposes? And that's why this study structure in terms of the development was, if not unique, I'm sure other folks do this, very promising as a way to design an experimental study and design, and through instrument development, also build program capacity and add to knowledge in the field. So somebody in the room who I interviewed, who's here but shall remain nameless, this went on very regularly, where I would test an item or a scale domain. So in red is the item I proposed, and this is what somebody at the top level of management in facing history said. Even a top facing history teacher might hesitate to respond positively. Such items might be more akin to a teacher's overall sense of confidence in herself as a teacher, or in her view of the difference that a teacher can or cannot make in a kid's life than what she does in facing history. So I'm not sure those would distinguish between facing history and non-facing history teachers, right? So this was an intimate process in terms of designing these measures and scales. What did we end up with? We ended up with 8 scales in the efficacy inventory that we used. 3 of the scales mapped. Are you familiar with the How People Learn framework? From some of you may be from Linda Darling-Hammond and Bransford and other folks. So there were a set of outcomes for facing history that had to do with strengthening teachers' ability to create certain kinds of teaching and learning environments in which civic, social and ethical, and history education with civic purposes could not take place if these environments did not exist. They had to be learner-centered, they had to be community-centered, and they had to be knowledge-centered. So when Dennis, and those of you who are familiar with Facing History, know that Facing History has a very specific scope and sequence, right? It really gives teachers, or aims to give teachers, guidance, right? What might you do first? What are the essential questions you might pose at the beginning of the year to develop a safe space for students? Then what might you segue into? How do you build knowledge? How do you create a knowledge-centered classroom environment, right? How do you create a learner-centered environment where you're attending to student differences in rich ways, and so on? The other domains aligned to the student outcomes that we were measuring in the study and that Facing History believes in strongly. And Dennis and I were having a conversation earlier, and we were talking about, can you really think of rich ways to study teacher growth if you don't first define the learning that they're trying to foster? Don't you have to do both, right? But it doesn't happen often enough. It doesn't happen often enough where you have studies of teacher learning that defines both the teacher knowledge base and the student knowledge base and how those connect. I'm just going to give you some examples of items so you could compare them to the Milson instrument and look at both in terms of specificity, but also in terms of how they might align more to a specific vision and understanding of civic, moral, and history education. So for those of you who are in the civic field and think about how to foster deliberation, right, democratic deliberation among students, one of the ideas in the field now is teachers really have to know when to disclose their own beliefs and when not to disclose their beliefs. Right? So again, it's linked to the field of studies around deliberation, specific ideas about how to teach that. And then the organization put a bet. Yeah, Facing History teachers might be more able to navigate this terrain than non-Facing History teachers. Here's one of the big promises, I think, of this kind of measure design method and also the significance for the field. What we had to do, and again, people don't do this enough, is you often read, don't you read articles that portray instruments and they have the items, but they don't have the specific domain or knowledge or skill that aligns to that item. So you can't really determine. It's hard to critically analyze a survey instrument if you don't know what the developers were trying to get at. So we really spent a lot of time articulating the knowledge and skill domains for Facing History teachers. I went to a program retreat for program associates, and I gave them the instrument, and I said, do you recognize these, right? Which do you prioritize in your work? Which should you prioritize more, do you feel? And it created a very rich discussion. Again, helping the organization talk about its work in more specific, more clearly defined ways. Don't get confused by all the arrows and everything. I just wanted to demonstrate that the other, and I said it a little bit before, that the other strength of this design was that as I was designing the teacher efficacy instruments, folks were designing the student instruments, and that we were aligning the constructs. Right? We paid very close attention to conceptual alignment. And I'll end there.
Before we transition to Bob, are there any questions for Ethan or me at this point? Okay, hopefully by the end you will have some. We're going to try to leave about 15 minutes or so for question and answer. Yeah.
Yes.
Seniority has its privileges. We're staying seated. I just mean olderness. Let me just see.
Can you hear Bob?
Right. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Right. So it was a cold and dark afternoon in December or January. Terry, would you stand up? Thank you. You may, just to be. It is. And Dennis said, came over, called me up, and they said, we have some funding. I listened. Can you get together with us? We want to talk to you about a project. They took me to Mrs. Bartley's. We had onion rings. We talked about the project. Dennis had written a preliminary proposal to study, to frame the study of the bulletproof study. He had conceptualized these three domains: the historical, the civic, and the ethical. And he and I had worked for many years on the ethical together, and so they kind of slowly, rolled this idea out to me. Daunted was a word that stands out. Why would anybody want to invest 5 years of their time in an evaluation study where the odds of having any meaningful results are very slim? Just a question. Just a question. So I was a little hesitant, but it was very exciting at the same time. So we started to lay out what some of the problems were. One of the problems, by the way, was, well, they funded the student outcome, but there's no money for the teacher outcome. Where's that going to come from? All right. So I'll give you an example. So we got together again. We kind of moved forward. This time it was at Charlie's. It was Guinness Burgers, right? And, we looked at each other and he said, bulletproof, what does bulletproof mean? Who does bulletproof, right? So that was the start. That was around 2000. That was the fall of 2005, yeah. I just want to point that out, that we didn't actually finish the student measures till the experimental intervention had already begun. We actually kind of put the last I and T on somewhere around December 2007 and actually did the evaluation 2008. That's a long time by the standards of experimental evaluations to pull your measures together. What does that mean? All right. Not a long time. It was a long time then. Not even. All right. The one decision that we need to make explicit was what facing history would we be evaluating? Because facing history, I can't essentialize it. It's very difficult, but one of its main characteristics is that it's a case study approach. Okay, it goes deep. Doesn't have a pace. Doesn't do pacing. Okay, it doesn't have pacing guides. It goes deep, and there's a number of different histories that they have in their research and development organization developed. The kind of standard bearer is Holocaust and human behavior. Okay, well, do we want to do Holocaust and human behavior? Do we want to do choices at Little Rock? These are not easy decisions to make. We went with the approach, Holocaust and human behavior, that had been most used regularly over the 30 years. Okay, so let me now I will see if I can talk and change this at the same time. Which way? There?
You only have one slide, maybe?
No, I have lots of slides.
Push the other arrow.
Could be. Wait, I know why it's backwards. I'm pointing it at me. Thank you. All right, now I'm most. All right. So this is a coming attraction. Excuse me? I want to stay there. I just wanted to make sure I didn't embarrass myself, later. I decided to do it up front. All right, so one of the interesting conversations we had, by this time, APT was aboard, right? When did you guys join?
We started conversations in late 2005.
Okay, and joined.
Actually, you and I had conversations in late 2005.
Right.
We began
At Lyman, in Elliott Lyman, we had
Elliott
a
Lyman,
Christmas party.
and then we ended up having conversations with folks at Facing History starting in, I think, February.
Yeah. So, and I think that's an example of social capital in a certain sense, because we really had to find the best folks. And one of the ways, as Dennis had said, there was a triumvirate of the three of us for a while there, and we needed to get expert opinions from John Willett, who wasn't going to do the heavy lifting, but was happy to give us kind of advice and consultation, from Chris Deedy on whether we ought to have an online evaluation. There's a lot of things in these kind of programs that evolve. They're like onions. You forget all the choices you make and as you skin, the peel off. So one of the most fun conversations that I can remember was one where Margot and Mark and Marty were in the room with Dennis and I folks and me. All right, we're going to assess a kid's historical understanding. How are we going to do it? All right, let's do a sort of similar kind of case study approach. So, all right, what will be the case that we'll pick? So Facing History folks, now, don't get me wrong, Facing History folks, they kind of said, well, how about the Weimar Republic? That's a good case, right? Or Kristallnacht. We'll give the experimental group Kristallnacht, we'll give the control group Kristallnacht. We'll see who does better on Kristallnacht. Any reactions from the crowd? It's a very quiet group. Either we are very intimidating or making no sense at all. But I'll wait. I'll just wait until somebody says something.
What kid's heard of any of those?
Excuse me?
What kid has heard of any of those?
Well, somebody who's taken the Facing History, Holocaust and Human Behavior. Yeah. So that wasn't going to work, right? So, this kind of conversation actually required, and it played out many times over, where the expertise would get passed from each of the three components. So I don't want to, in other words, there were times when APT had the voice of authority, and I can just remember as if it were yesterday, Beth saying, no, we're not doing that. Because that would be a kind of fatal flaw to anyone who wanted to have a bulletproof kind of evaluation. Okay? But there were just as many times when Facing History had to say to APT or to Bob and Ethan the exact same kind of thing. No, we're not doing that because that really wouldn't kind of reflect our theory of change. That really would not really kind of be in alignment with what our purpose is. So we picked the case study that I expect most of you are only vaguely familiar with. I certainly am only vaguely familiar with, which was the Yugoslavian uprisings and war in the Balkans in the late 1980s and 1990s. Very few people really know this history. Kids certainly didn't know this history. People have heard of Tito, more or less, and they get Tito every once in a while if they get that far in their European history. But they don't really know what went on there, and in a certain sense, you could say none of us ever know. But in the more general sense, it was a complicated conflict among Bosnians, Muslims, Serbian Orthodox Christians, and even Roman Catholics. And most people remember ethnic cleansing. Most people remember the Serbs coming through Bosnia and wiping out, moving from Serbia to Bosnia and wiping out whole villages. Okay? So we decided we would use that as our assessment case. So this is an example of a document that we gave to students to look at. It's not very different from the New York Regions. It's a document that we used to assess what the field of historical understanding calls a historical causality. Okay? I mean, it's historical causality because, in some sense, because it was from 1980 to 1996. Okay? It's about economics. Economics is pretty much about causality most of the time as a social science. So the question was, how might kids understand that chart? Okay? With me? Thank you. I need some feedback. So here's a question for you, okay? Anybody want to tell me whether that chart demonstrates the first claim? True or false? You're right. Thank you. The second one?
What did they say?
You know as well as I do. It was in their mind. So if you're scared, think how kids are feeling. If you're nervous to make a mistake, and I'm nervous to make a mistake, have a little historical empathy for the kids. Okay? I would claim that the first A is generally true and B is generally false. Let's take a look. You agree with me? Yeah. Generally, without being postmodern. All right? About all this. Right. So, all right. This you could view this as a comprehension measure. All right? This is not too hard, and it may be an interpretation of historical causality, but you could also think of it. Well, like if a lot of kids get this right on the test, then most of the kids understand. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's how we viewed it. It's basically a tapping into comprehension. And by and large, most of the 9th and 10th graders in this study, whether they were in the experimental or in the control group, got that correct. Okay? Now this was a little harder, and I'm going to come back to it. I'm not going to linger on it now. I'm going to come back to it a little bit at the end of my presentation. Okay? This is a rating and ranking approach to evaluation. It asks kids to take a look at the chart. Here are some ways to understand how the changes in the economy might have created conditions that led to war. How would you rate each of these explanations based upon the chart that they saw? That's pretty much the evidence that they had. Okay, and so these items are theory driven. They are actually designed to reflect a current movement in the field of historical understanding, which is a cognitive developmental approach applied called progression modeling. Okay, that it's not obvious which of these three items are the more or less sophisticated, but they are written to reflect greater or lesser sophistication. So I don't really, it's not the point at this point to understand which is which, but that's the kind of measurement that we gave to students, okay? To assess their historical understanding, right? I'm going to come back to this. Now I want to take a detour, all right? A total detour. Ready? How many saw that article? Small, right? But fascinating. Typical New York Times article. Maybe 3 columns, 6 inches by 4 inches. But it really caught my attention. Let's stay with this for a couple of minutes before we head back, okay? Now, in that article, there was a reporting, a journalism of reports of the advocates for infusing gay history into California history frameworks and standards and against, okay? So I'm going to share with you what I took from that article, okay? I can go here. If you put in the story of Harvey Milk or Bayard Rustin, it will be a good thing because this is a history. This is the history standards, Okay? It will prevent bullying, shatter stereotypes, and help students see they are part of a broader community. Okay. Same article. It will prematurely settle the issue whether homosexuality was something one chooses or is bohème with. It'll water down the state curriculum. It'll distract students from learning the basics. It'll be too nebulous without evidence as to what is. I did this afternoon. AG appropriate, what is even appropriate at all. Now, isn't that interesting? That's just in one little article. So, I mean, we know this. Most of us in this room know these kind of discussions for one kind of cultural division or another. But it's still, every time one sees it, one is struck by the power of the perspectives on both sides and how strong they are. Okay? You know, so what does that have to do with economic charts about about economic gross national product of the combined republics in Yugoslavia? And in fact, one advocate, I don't spell that well either, claimed it has nothing to do with sex. That was a big claim. This has nothing to do with sex. Is that right? Is that a claim that you buy into or not? No. Go ahead. Say. You want to say something about? Yeah, if you will. You don't have to. Yeah.
Obviously, there's so much more to be given about sex, but clearly it's a big one.
That's a good.
And it's hiding part of the truth to say that it's not. And it's making it seem like there's something bad to deny.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I don't think everyone could hear you. So, you want to repeat what you said? Okay. Well, you said it's a large part of it. It's hiding the truth to some extent, but it is about sex. It's not all about what it is. But that's the discussion. Yeah. Yeah. But that's the discussion that is emerging out of what goes into the history frameworks. Okay? So here's a couple of underlying questions that are important to me. Okay? I'm not saying they're important to everybody. What lessons do students actually take away from different history courses? That's an is question, a naturalistic question. And what lessons should they take away? And I'm going to go, I only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly and talk about the kinds of assumptions that we all have about why we teach history courses in the public schools and why they are so boring. Okay, other than facing histories. Okay, one is that aim is to teach some kind of community building. American exceptionalism is one example of that. A second is we bring what we have learned from the past to present conditions. A third is that it's being and becoming disciplined. Okay, learning how to synthesize evidence, etc. and so forth. It has an interdisciplinarity aim to it, that it's an attempt to promote the integration of ethics, civic, and historical understanding. Which of those represents facing history? If this, what did you say?
I said all of them.
Right. I would agree. All of them. Okay? Yeah. But you can't do them all at once, and you have to kind of you have to figure out how to organize, to structure your approach. The measurement of strategy that we undertook primarily focused on 3, which you just saw an example of, okay, which was a disciplinary approach, and 4, okay, and so this is a plug for a chapter that Janet Kwok and I wrote called Informed Social Reflection, Its Development and Importance for Adolescent Civic Engagement. And it is an attempt to make the argument for the importance of integrating historical understanding, ethical reflection, and civic knowledge into a comprehensive kind of approach to the assessment of impact. And a lot of that came out of the very original kind of conceptualization that Dennis had put together 5 years ago. Okay? So, oops, sorry. I want to add one more aim to why we study history, and that is what we can call constructive criticism. Does Facing History do that? Yeah. All right, so you can feel how challenging it was to develop an assessment technique. So if you want to find out what happened in the study when we focused on 3 and 4, okay, and you've seen a little bit of the design of the measures we used, and of course there are much more, I turn the microphone over to my respected colleague from Apt Associates. Give her 20 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to not gallop necessarily, but trot through what we are going to talk about this afternoon so that we have an opportunity to talk a little bit amongst ourselves as a group. One of the things that I want to note is that Rachel and I are here today. We're just 2 of the people from APT who worked on this study. Beth Boulay is the project director. She couldn't be here today. Mark Moss helped to do a lot of the thinking about measures and the design up front and was involved in the analysis, and Christina Cleoris was also involved. So I just think it's important to acknowledge other people who played quite important roles in the study. I'm going to talk very quickly about the design, give you a little sense about the sample. We've heard some conversation about the measures already, and I'll spend some time talking about the findings as well. So, can I ask you to do that? Yeah. Okay. So, we've talked a little bit, Dennis has already, about the importance for this study to be an RCT, an experimental study, where we try to learn something about what is the impact of a program for one group compared to another group. And the only thing that distinguishes one group from another is the program. So in this study, we focused just on the one particular strand of Facing History. We didn't look at the breadth and depth of all of the different resources and programs and efforts that the Facing History and Ourselves organization routinely carries out. We focus just on the Holocaust and Human Behavior unit and teachers who were using that unit. And my colleagues here have alluded to the different complexities that the study had, including unfolding over time. We started these conversations in late 2005. We didn't collect the first data until the summer of 2007. So we spent quite a bit of time thinking about the measures once we knew what the design was. We also spent a lot of time recruiting schools to participate. This is also a multifaceted study because we're looking at different participants. We're looking at teachers, we're looking at schools, we're looking at students, we're looking at different domains. So all of those things together help to create a study that actually is quite complex. So there are a couple of there are 2 main categories of questions that the study was designed to address in this, quote, bulletproof, end quote, way, where we really wanted to be able to answer with confidence, with some certainty, questions about what are the impacts on teachers in a few different domains, and what are the impacts on students of those teachers in a number of different domains. So these are the questions that we asked about within the experiment. So we're looking at what are the average impacts on teachers who are in the Facing History group? What are the average impacts on the students who were in those teachers' classrooms? Some of the other things that I'll talk about a little bit later occur outside of this, this experimental framework, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But one of the other things that I want to note, when we designed the study and we're thinking about recruiting schools and recruiting teachers to participate in this study, where some teachers would participate in facing history, professional development, seminars, access to ongoing resources and support, and others would not, just leaving that second group as it was anathema to the organization. It was not morally appropriate that we would recruit some people to participate into a study, and then those people would simply once and forever and always be in the control group. So the study used a design feature that we call a lagged design, where the teachers who were not receiving facing history in the first year then themselves participated in the seminars and having access to resources in the second year. We continue to collect data from the year 1 teachers as well as the year 2 teachers, but the contrast between the program and the control teachers comes from looking at teachers in that first year. So, let me describe the sample for the study. We had a target of about 80 schools, and we got pretty close to that. We were interested in having schools that look a lot like the kinds of schools that Facing History ordinarily works with. We wanted to make sure that the schools and teachers we were recruiting just for the purposes of this study weren't so unusual that we couldn't apply what we learned from this study to what it might mean to how Facing History operates in outside of the framework of the study. So the schools were distributed across the country. They varied enormously in terms of size. The smallest school had fewer than 100 students. The largest school, over 4,000. Those are really quite different sizes of schools. The student populations were quite diverse, and the schools themselves were diverse. There were about 2/3 of the schools were public schools, about 20% were charter schools, and we had some private schools. Again, all of this was very important from an organizational point of view to make sure that that what we learned would make sense after the study was over. The program teachers, what we think of as the treatment in some respects, treatment versus control, all participated in seminars and professional development in the summer of 2007 before they then began to implement the HHB unit at some point during the 2007-08 school year. And the control teachers all participated in that same sequence of activities 1 year later. One other thing I want to note is that these teachers taught social studies, English, humanities, history, so they could teach different things. The outcome measures, we've heard some discussion about this already. And I want to pick up on one thing that Ethan said when he referenced an existing measure. It was important in this study not to use only brand new measures, because we wanted to be able to link what we learned in this study to what other studies had done before. We wanted to be able to guard against the possibility of someone saying, well, of course they found this because no one's ever used that measure before, and they developed it just for this study, and we don't know if it applies in other settings. So as we were thinking about developing new measures and using new measures, we also wanted to hold on to using at least 1 or 2 or more scales that came from other kinds of studies. It helps build a bridge of continuity with prior work and with other work that might come after the fact.
So another, just quickly, we've talked a little bit about what the schedule was, referencing when teachers started to participate. We collected baseline data from teachers, that's teachers in both groups, in the summer of 2007, and then we followed up in the spring of 2008, again in the spring of 2009. We surveyed students in the spring of 2008, students of all of those teachers. We followed up with a subset of students in the spring of 2009. We didn't survey all of the students then. And we also collected information from regional staff because we were interested in trying to understand not only what the impact of the program was on teachers and students, but we wanted to know more about what the implementation was like. And I'll come back to that as we go on. So a snapshot of the study findings. After 1 year, we found consistent evidence that there were statistically significant impacts on most of the teacher outcomes and statistically significant impacts on some student outcomes. More statistically significant impacts for teachers than for students. What we learned after 2 years was that what we observed in terms of teachers and what they reported about self-efficacy and attitudes and perceptions about teaching, those impacts were quite stable from year 1 to year 2. I'm going to put up on the screens some of the findings, and because we didn't think that this would be so easy to read, we actually have a handout that has this in more detail. Because I don't expect people to be able to read some of these numbers from where they're sitting, but some folks may have picked these up already. But many of the items on the teacher surveys or the teacher battery are on scales that of agreement that ask people to indicate whether they strongly agree, disagree, etc. And some of the measures are on a scale of frequency, that, ranging from never to every day or more often. So when you look at what the means are, the control group mean, that's the average across all of the teachers who did not have facing history in year 1. And the facing history group mean is the average across all the participating facing history teachers. And there are significant effects on teachers that are in the direction that we would hypothesize for facing history having particular kinds of effects for 10 of the 12 different outcomes. That's consistent evidence that the program is, it is the program itself that is having an effect on what teachers are reporting and characterizing in their own beliefs. One other thing that I would like to point your attention to is the last column on the right. That's called an effect size. That tells us how large, what the magnitude of the differences between the teachers who are the facing history teachers and the control group teachers. And the effect sizes here are actually substantial when we think about educational evaluation research. More typical effect sizes for educational interventions are 0.2 and below. So things that are at, this is half a standard deviation unit, things that are in this size actually are big. That's not by chance. This is telling us that the program has had an effect. One other thing that I want to note is that there are a couple of these. If you might look and say, well, actually, the facing history score is lower than the control group score, and that's okay, because for some of these scales, when things happen less often, that's actually what we might hypothesize would happen, that people report feeling burned out much less So a lower score would tell us that actually the facing history teachers are not quite so depressed or dissatisfied with what they're doing. So now, quickly, this is a cover of what the student survey looked like. Student outcomes for civic learning. This is Exhibit 2 in the handout that you have. Here we have a number of different kinds of outcomes and subcategories for the different domains, and there are significant differences in 4 of the outcomes, and the effect sizes for these are actually smaller than what we observed for teachers. And at the same time, some of these that are statistically significant are in line with what you might expect for an educational intervention that shows an effect, that has an impact. As on the teacher outcome tables, some of these we would hypothesize to have lower scores that we would associate with fewer attitudes that are racist or intolerant, for example. So continuing on, looking at social awareness, interpersonal relationships, and historical understanding. There is one statistically significant effect here, and it's for historical understanding. So what Bob was describing before in terms of asking students to use different kinds of prompts and primary source materials to understand a problem, use evidence to think about it, draw upon the skills that we would hypothesize are characteristic of good history teaching, regardless of the content. Facing history students performed better than the control students. And that's actually quite important because we spent so much time thinking about what a good measure of historical understanding was. So it was a validation on one hand that we were able to measure something and actually see that it did tap into something that distinguishes what students take away from participating in facing history. So now let me step back for a second. I've rushed through these findings, I know. I've gone pretty quickly. What does it all mean? Well, we certainly have consistent evidence that facing history has an impact on what teachers report in terms of their self-efficacy and multiple domains, and there are differences for the majority of outcomes that we tested. There's less consistent evidence, still some positive evidence that participating students experience different outcomes than the control group peers. So why do you think we might have seen these particular results? Does anyone have a suggestion about what might explain why you see something that affects teachers more than it affected their students? I'll
Maybe the teachers were thinking about it more sort of metacognitively than the students. In the sense
Okay.
that they're kind of aware that they're part of a program with these goals, and the students are a little result more of a disconnect.
Okay, that's a possibility. Other possibilities? Sir?
I think there may be a correlation between the amount of time the teachers spend with the material. Teaching 5 classes a day, you're studying to prepare for those 5 classes, you're going over the same material 5 times. Students encounter what that particular lesson is once.
That's interesting.
So, it's likely, and then the student goes on to physics or something else.
Okay. I think certainly think that has.
I think there's a big difference in what you're measuring. So what the teachers are being measured on is something that they're passionate about, their careers, and then specific domains what you're measuring for the students has a lot more to do with culture and broad sweeping things in the society, for instance, racist attitudes. I mean, it's very difficult to move that. I would be interested to see if it even moved that for the teachers, because it is such a predominant part of the American experience. And you're measuring very different things.
These are excellent points, and we can come back to some of these points in a minute, but is there someone else who?
What is the element of choice teachers choose to get professional development? A lot of reasons do, whereas students, they get what they get.
Well, remember, I mean, when we recruited teachers to participate in the study, they agreed that they would implement the HHB unit in the following year or the year after. So the teachers had signed a contract, basically. But I think you're still picking up on something else that others have picked up as well, that teachers were more directly participating in the Facing History program. Certainly, that's one thing. But what we couldn't do in this study was say, I want you to teach it 5 days a week, I want you to teach it 4 days a week, I want you to teach it 3, you 2, you 1, whatever. We couldn't predetermine how often people would teach or with what intensity people would teach or with what conviction or skill. So that actually is why it was important for the study to try to think about implementation as well.
Can I refer?
Yes?
Well, I think to build a little bit on what Blake said, I think that we're asking the teachers to self-report on their own sense of efficacy. I think what we're asking the students to do is perform an understanding. And I think performing an understanding is a high bar, so that in a certain sense we set the bar very high for the program,
right,
to have an impact by setting the bar very high for the students.
For the students. I agree with you completely about that. If we had resources to do some of the other kinds of data collection that would tell us more about the implementation fidelity of teachers, about the quality of what they were doing, the thoroughness of what they were doing, then we might have some different information. But you're right. I mean, when we're asking, but some of the student measures are also self-report.
That's right.
So I think there's a spectrum.
And I thought if I may just say, your point about using something old, something new, borrowed and so forth is really important. That we needed to hear from you that we ought not just
start over. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so how did we try to measure the implementation? Well, we collected data from the participating teachers, and we asked them questions about how much time they spent and what kinds of resources they used. Facing History staff created a measure of fidelity using information from the surveys. And we helped to validate that measure by comparing information that we got from Facing History staff with what we learned from the program associates and the regional staff who interacted much more frequently with the specific teachers who were part of the study. The questions that we asked the teachers were about how much time they spent covering different things, which particular topic areas they covered, and there could be lots of different reasons for thinking that there might be some variation across the teachers. Some teachers might have said, I don't really need to go get those resources because I have really good resources in my own library. Some teachers could have been in classrooms or in schools, where the principals changed their minds about what they thought was important professional development for the teachers that year. So the teachers ended up being able to participate less frequently in facing history professional development. But again, in this part of the study, we're outside of the experimental design framework where we're assigning people to one group or another. Here, it's all what people choose to do themselves. So we don't have as good a way to control it in a statistical sense and measure it. Anyway, what we did with all of this information from surveys and from the reports back from the regional staff, we were able to group teachers into a few different categories on the basis of their responses to questions like the next slide, where we asked how much time people spent. The original contract had asked teachers to commit to 20 hours, at least 20 hours of teaching the HHB unit. That corresponds more or less to about 6 weeks. And if you look at this, more than a quarter of the teachers who were in the study spent less than the 20 hours that they had indicated they would. So that might influence what we actually see in terms of implementation fidelity. So on the other hand, almost as many teachers spent more than 50 hours. So we have an interesting distribution that's sort of more bimodal than uniform. But this information can be helpful to facing history as it thinks about how it works with teachers going forward. So we also looked at what teachers said they did, which resources they used, again, there's a lot of variation. The majority used 3 things, and fewer reported using guest speakers, other resource books, than the HHB resource book, or an online campus. On the basis of this information, then we grouped the teachers into high, medium, and low implementation fidelity, and about almost half of the teachers were implementing with what facing history staff deemed would characterize high fidelity, where they were using the resources, they taught for more than 20 hours, and so on.
And I'd just chime in really quickly that Exhibit 4 in your handout shows the frequency with which teachers used different or touched upon different topics of the scope and sequence.
Right.
And
yes.
so, Facing History feels that it's really important to cover the scope and sequence in this specific order and spend enough time on each of the topics. The slide is a little too small to see up here, but you'll see that not everybody followed the entire scope and sequence. Not everybody touched upon all of the different topic areas. And this amount of time spent in the scope and sequence is also included in the fidelity measure.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So, wrapping up, I just want to emphasize that we spent nearly about as much time planning what we were going to do as doing it, and I think that that's an important takeaway for folks who are thinking about designing different kinds of research projects. It's sort of what goes in comes out. It's clear that there was a lot of careful attention spent to the measures, to thinking that what was important to measure, and so on. Bob talked about this too, that we had to make sure from the beginning that any kind of measure that we would use for teachers or for students would make sense and wouldn't, for both the facing history and for the control teachers and students, it couldn't favor one versus another, so that really paid off. But I think the findings at this stage point to at least 3 different challenges, and I'm sure there are more. But facing history is trying ultimately to change what happens for students. And it has to work through teachers. So the primary audience for participating in the program is teachers. It's not students who come in and experience the seminars, it's teachers. And we see huge effects on the teachers. And we have to spend some time thinking, all right, well, what else can happen in a study or in research if we're trying to go through one medium to change another? And I think that's a perennial issue in educational research. A second challenge is that there's clearly variation in what people are doing in the implementation fidelity, at least in this, in this particular set of teachers in their classrooms. And what we learned in the study from that, I think, has implications for what Facing History does, how it interacts with teachers, what it expects of teachers, what the regional staff might do, and so on. And a related point is that you can't assign people to do something well. You can you can learn something about people who get one service or another, but you don't know what they're going to do with what they are offered. And that's a challenge in any kind of study. Anyway, I think that's it for now.
Well, what I want to do before we open it up is, Bob, if you can, in one sentence, say something about the ongoing work that you're doing with graduate students, and then I'll make a point, and then we'll open it up.
Make one
and
point
Ethan
too.
too, and you too. Quickly though.
Well,
We're going to run out of time.
very long sentence. There's a handout that, you can hear me, right? There's a handout that lists, and Dennis put this together, measures related papers and presentations. And if you think back to the historical understanding measure, you probably don't remember this. There was a little question after the part of the assessment where we asked the students to rank and rate each of the options, which we could get a score from, and that was why. Why did you rank and rate these? And that, one of the wonderful luxuries or advantages of this kind of a partnership is that even after the resources for the particular project have ended, there are interested folks who will really keep exploring. So we've really been we don't have the exact same amount of momentum, but we are looking at some of the whys behind the impact. So why did the kids make the choices they did? And that's a belief of the organization Facing History that it's important not just to demonstrate their own effectiveness, but to contribute to the field by increasing the knowledge base about in this particular case, about adolescent development.
Yeah,
that was one sentence.
And just very quickly, I talked about the mediator of teacher to student, and we chose to include in the experimental study efficacy beliefs, but we also included in the study that was not in the experimental study in the end, a performance of understanding for the teachers, where they get a historical text they have to interact with, as well as a classroom scenario, a situation of ostracism in the classroom that they have to reflect on. So we're still in the process of exploring that, and Ling is working on that, and groups of folks are working on that too. And we might be able, that might ultimately prove to be a stronger determinant of what happens with teachers and then what happens with students.
And then my final comment is, and believe me, we're opening it up. Facing History believes it's important to, in interpreting the findings, to think about what's suggested by the fact that teacher efficacy outcomes are aligned with student outcomes, such that teachers believed they were able to do the very things that students demonstrated being able to do. What does that mean? It suggests something that we think is worth thinking about, that we think speaks to the issue of teacher effectiveness, which is it's beyond teachers believing that they could do it, but in fact students were demonstrating in certain areas that they were able to do what the teachers believed they were more capable of doing. Questions, comments, suggestions?
We can hang on.
I know that it's
Yeah,
almost at
Liz.
the end of the time, but yes, go.
I wondered if you could say a bit more about the measures for historical understanding and to what extent they were really specifically historical versus kind of using sources of comprehension or piecing together kind of way.
Well, we built the coding scheme on the work of Ashby and Lee. Okay, so that the items, if you went back and looked at we didn't really spend a lot of time reading the actual responses, but for example, the economic indicator had 3 kinds of interpretations of the graph, and to some degree, there's always a kind of dynamic between the particularity of the discipline, in this case historical understanding, and the generality of cognitive development. But in the case of these measures, we tried as hard as we could to lean as far toward the particularity of the kinds of constructs history researchers actually use to measure the kind of skills and competencies that they would like to see kids develop to be good at doing historical analyses.
I think it's also fair to say that the historical understanding measure was modeled on like an advanced placement exam in history, sort of structured in a way that presents different kinds of material for students to read.
Comprehensive measure, right?
Right, to sort of read, understand, and use in answering questions. So it's a way to assess thinking skills. Certainly they're cognitive in nature as opposed to fact-based historical understanding.
And those thinking skills were specifically agency, causation, and evidence.
Well, I guess the thing.
So there were items for each of those and comprehension questions as well, because we wanted to make sure that the students were actually understanding the content, and then we wanted to assess their thinking skills in those areas.
And even more content-based, which I'm sure you can take a look at the assessment. We selected documents and archival data that were testimonies from witnesses, components of a constitution, so that they were clearly archival materials that most people would see as primarily historical.
I wonder, what struck me about this is that the effect on the teachers is really quite extraordinary in some ways. It's huge, finding criteria.
Yeah.
But I think that if you think of other innovative experiments in education, and there's several I can think of, the really crucial thing long term is probably that the teacher thinks differently about what they're doing.
Yes.
And as a consequence of that, they reframe their whole pedagogic agenda, not necessarily only in that one area.
Right.
So you're not just adding another topic to what they're doing, you're adding a whole new way of thinking. And that's, as you say, very difficult to measure, but you've also got some pretty good measures and something actually is happening. But I think that what you're creating is a transformation in how teachers think about what they are doing and what they can do, which I think is probably actually very important, very in the long run, very, very effective. I think that the effect on children may be quite slow, and it may be a kind of drip thing over time, such that people talk about what they're doing in the classroom differently. In 10 years' time, it begins to have an effect on the kids. I mean, I was thinking that one of the parallels is the impact of Larry Colbert's just community work. I mean, in the short term, effects are pretty minimal.
Right.
They do with the measure. Yet, the generation of teachers we've been on the far, far fringes of Pentecostal intellectual much more central.
And
I think that's really the message. That's the positive message.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, the underlying hypothesis that you have articulated about let's look at what happens to the students in the same teachers over time was something that we wrote into our unfortunately unsuccessful I3 application last year, where we had hoped that we would be able to follow teachers in their first year, second year, and third year and look at the outcomes for students in those teachers' classes over time. But in this study, we were trading off different constraints and sort of what could we do in what amount of time. But you're absolutely right that there may be sleeper effects or some other thing that we would.
Well, another way to respond to that is if you think about the student effects, if they were compounded over time by being exposed to teachers teaching in this way in additional classes throughout their careers, these effect sizes are small for one unit, but if you added together additional exposure over time, what might happen? So, whole school models that Facing History is working on, in fact, do that.
And I'd chime into exposure from teachers who have more experience. So these teachers in our study all were 1 year out of HHB. You would imagine that after you teach a unit, you've done it a couple times, you might get better, the impacts on students might evolve as well.
The fact that we saw teacher impacts in the second year that were stable suggests some glue to what the experience has been. I mean, it doesn't fade, at least not after 2 years. So
that speaks to sustainability in terms of the teachers remaining and teaching and impacting new kids each year, new students. Thank you for your attention. Mark, did you have one last comment?
Oh, sort of, I'm the program director of Facing History, and I actually going into this, the skeptic that I am, I thought there would be very little results on kids, because after, as Ted said, you expose them to something for 4 weeks, and then you're taking, this isn't the standard test where you're saying, comprehension. This is applying what you're learning and having an analytical framework to be able to interpret other types of, information. I was shocked that we got that kind of reaction. I knew that the teachers, we would do well, but I was actually going even further down, saying you would need a whole different series of measures, or you could, judge this when people were taking a course over a whole year, which, happens in many cases in schools.
Yeah.
So
We were pleasantly surprised. Thank you. The room is needed at 5 o'clock, so if you want to talk with us outside, we'll move outside, but thanks for coming and participating.
Thanks, Helen.